Good evening and welcome to our First Amendment and the Civil Rights Movement, our keynote event on this Monday for our First Amendment Days 2021. My name is Julie Rosa, and I am the First Amendment Specialist and an adjunct assistant professor at the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication. I have the great privilege of chairing the First Amendment Committee, which is charged with planning and producing our First Amendment Days. This is our 19th year of hosting First Amendment Days at Iowa State University. Our goal is to educate and to celebrate the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: speech, press, petition, assembly, and religion. Yes, 19 years of spotlighting those 5 freedoms in all of their amazing, wonderful, messy, confounding glory. Our theme this year is Some Assembly Required, and we are taking a closer look at the right of assembly and petitioning the government for redress of grievances. This is exactly why I am thrilled to bring you tonight's lecture. Can there be any more compelling case for the importance of the First Amendment's 5 freedoms than the Civil Rights Movement? I think not, and our 2 experts tonight are going to help explain why. These 2 individuals have an amazing list of accomplishments and credits to their name. I'm only going to share a few. First, Jean Policinski is the Chief Operating Officer of the Freedom Forum Institute and the Institute's First Amendment Center. A veteran multimedia journalist, he also writes, lectures, and is interviewed regularly on First Amendment issues. Policinski, a founding editor of USA Today, oversees all programs of the Freedom Forum Institute and also is a longtime proponent of diversity in journalism as an essential characteristic of a free press. He speaks and writes regularly on news gathering, news reporting, newsroom diversity, and journalism ethics. With him tonight is Professor Emeritus Robert Bickel. Professor Bickel taught at Stetson University for almost 40 years. His national awards include the American Bar Association's Harrison Tweed Award for Continuing Legal Education and the Florida Bar's Faculty Professionalism Award. In 1994, he was elected to the American Law Institute, and he is a fellow of the National Association of College and University Attorneys. Joining Stetson's faculty in 1978, Professor Bickel served as an assistant dean and created the school's first federal civil procedure class. He also created and launched the National Conference on Law and Higher Education. Our 2 experts have created a fantastic multimedia resource designed to illuminate the intersection between the First Amendment and the Civil Rights Movement. They will tell you about this resource just launched in February, but even more so, they will tell us how the First Amendment provided the foundation for the Civil Rights Movement. We will start by listening to a conversation between Jean and Robert, and then we'll have time for your questions, which you can type in the YouTube chat as we go along. I would like to thank the Department of History at Iowa State University for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and the ISU Committee on Lectures for its support, which is funded by the student government. I'd also like to thank members of the First Amendment Committee and the Greenlee School of Journalism, and of course, thank you to Iowa State University. Now, Jean, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor for both of us to be with you tonight. I remember the very first kickoff night or the very first week and for First Amendment Days. And it's been an amazing process to watch this unfold over almost 20 years. So again, on behalf of my colleague, Professor Bickel, and I, thank you for letting us be with you tonight. It is a time when petition and assembly, and by incorporation, really free speech and free press, and even freedom of religion are at the top of the news. We have only to look at the headlines from today, unfortunately, to see that Americans are using those rights to bring attention, focus the nation's attention really on matters that in some ways to me are unconscionable, but also which command our attention in order to remedy them. And that's really what our course is about, and what our conversation tonight, we hope not only between Professor Bickel and myself, but with you, will be about, is this marvelous ability of the First Amendment from the first day after its adoption in 1791 as part of the Bill of Rights to this very moment, to be a mechanism for us to talk to each other as Americans across a lot of boundaries that we've created or that existed in our society or still exist. The founders had a hope that if we could only talk to each other under the First Amendment, we would arrive, without government interference, I should say, we would arrive at the greatest possible solution for the greatest number of people in the shortest amount of time. Note, none of that implied perfection. It didn't really set a time frame, because I think they realized that there were matters that not insoluble, but which would take a great deal of discussion or time. And then frankly, we also have to admit the failings that they hid the number one issue probably facing the country then and perhaps now, which was the issue of then slavery. And today it's really equality, engagement, and inclusion that we still grapple with. You know, when Professor Bickel and I first met, I think it was in 2014, after a series of meetings, Professor Bickel will talk about, where he was leading students from Stetson on a tour of civil rights locations. We both felt very strongly that we needed to highlight this incredible moment in the nation's history from the early 1950s into through the 60s, and this intersection of this First Amendment ability for us to talk and course correct with this powerful movement that, in my mind, was the best example of the use of all five freedoms, because obviously the church had sheltered and provided inspiration for those seeking equality and inclusion and equity. But also then clearly free speech and free press were ways for those who were not permitted in discussions or across this country very often by the majority, were able to grab the nation's attention. And then using the powers of assembly and petition, which is the right of everyone to ask government to seek change from the government, to affect one of the greatest changes in societal law and in attitude our nation has ever seen. So we hope that by taking a look at this particular period, which roughly 1950s and 60s, we will encourage others to apply the activities, the lessons, the approaches of that period to the contemporary issues that still bedevil this country. My particular focus, of course, is on press in terms of the creation of this course. And in looking back, I was struck by a few things. Frankly, it was a period in which the historical and deliberate ignorance and disconnect between civil rights, what we would call today civil rights actions, and the engagement of people of color in our society were often ignored by the mainstream press. And we saw that reverse, where mainstream press across the country, and very often changing the nature of local press, suddenly brought these matters in truth to the attention of their readers and viewers. And that brings me to the second press point. We've recognized, we hope in this course, that in the 1950s, what we had was the emergence of that tremendously dramatic medium, television, which brought the indignities and the disconnect and the civil rights cases that we will talk about tonight into people's homes, into their living rooms, in a way that had not happened before. So you had this unique confluence of activism and I think journalism realizing the great deficiencies. Again, not perfect, not perfection, but in the main, bringing the attention of the nation to these issues that for some people, frankly, could be conveniently either ignored, treated with benign neglect, or deliberately distorted in many cases. I think that what we would like to have you take away, if you will, from tonight is this idea that there's this continuity between what occurred in this modern civil rights movement and the activities that are going on today, Black Lives Matter and other protests. And with that, I would like to turn this over for a second to my colleague, Professor Bickel.
Thank you, Gene. I want you to pretend for a moment that you're not looking at a 78-year-old professor emeritus. Pretend I'm your age. The transformative effect that led to this course was born in this simple story. In 1958, I moved from the north to the south. My parents made that decision, and I entered an all-white high school because they moved to a city that was nationally famous as an apartheid city that segregated Black folks literally and firmly. My high school years were the years of and following Little Rock and the integration, the desegregation of Central High School. If that's not amazing enough, I entered college within months of the first sit-ins in Greensboro and Nashville. In my law school years, after the loss of President Kennedy during my college years, my law school years were the years of Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy, both in his capacity as a senator and then as a candidate for president. Months before I graduated, we lost Robert Kennedy. We lost Martin, and then we lost Robert Kennedy. And in those 10 years, in those 10 years, my life was totally and completely reshaped. And so today, you see an old man who was a child of the movement. And for me, the movement is the perfect story, intellectually and emotionally, for wherever we go and however we might get there. Julie and Gene have both told you that all 5 freedoms of the First Amendment were implicated in the movement. Let me make that specific. For the last 20 years of my career, my 3 courses have been civil rights history as a teacher, civil rights history, the travel course in civil rights history, and employment discrimination, the economic part of equal justice, the part that was included in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I created those 3 courses because they define today every single social and economic issue that your generation will confront and which you will either report on and about which you will educate America, or which you will live in some role that produces social change. when I began the classroom course, I knew what I just told you, that the movement remains the greatest resource. I know it occurred between 1955 and 1965, but it remains step by step the greatest resource for how your generation will face every social issue you confront. There's been no people's movement, no movement in journalism, no movement in politics, no other example, no cases in the courts like those that defined the period from 1955 to 1965. And though these years have passed and you see now this 78-year-old professor emeritus, your template was the movement's template. And the more you know about it, the better you are prepared for your future. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But let me first tell you about the second part of my teaching that Jean has mentioned, and that is the travel course. As a part of my teaching of civil rights history, when I created the subject, to the delight of our curriculum committee, by the way, because our constitutional law courses were diminishing the petition clause and diminishing actually the civil rights amendments, the 14th, 15th amendments, and the petition clause of the First Amendment. So this was a chance to reawaken them. And we reawakened them not just in the classroom, but through another idea. I wondered to myself, as I relived my own experience in the movement and how personal it was, and therefore how transformative for the rest of my life, I decided to create a traveling classroom. And the first 25 of my students that I selected actually boarded a bus, went to 6 cities where the principal events of the movement took place. And my students sat with and heard the stories of the veterans of those sit-ins. And I want to tell you 2 tiny sub-stories. The first is that all of these people, as my students met them, were instantly heroes to them. They saw these 70-something-year-old people, and they were amazed just to be in their presence. And they viewed them as people who had reshaped America. That inspired them. But then they realized that when these students did that, they were in college and graduate school. And so very quickly, one night, as we were speaking with the veterans, the students noticed the veterans talking among themselves, joking, sometimes cajoling each other. And one of my students came to me and said, "Look at them, Professor. They're 20 years old again.
Yeah.
I'm seeing them now as they were when they were in college. And if they could do what they did at their age, we can do it at our age." The second sub-story I call coming home. In one of our middle or later travel courses, I stayed back to interview veterans for this online course that we've done. And my adjunct assistant professor took the students to the Atlanta airport to fly home. And I wondered how they were doing, so I called. And I asked her, "Are you having any problems or are things okay?" And she said, "I'm actually having a problem." And I asked her what the problem was, and she said, "They don't want to go home. They don't want to go home." And it was at that moment I realized that learning needs to be transformative. We got back and I asked the students to comment about that. And all of you know the great phrase, student evaluations. We've always done student evaluations of the course. And so I began asking students to complete those evaluations very deliberately. And only one common comment showed. The others were different details that they loved about the course or different experiences they were still processing. But one comment was in every single evaluation, and that is, this course was life-changing. So we knew we had something, and I approached Jean, and Jean and I bonded, and we knew that this was a still living history. The veterans were still with us, but they wouldn't be for much longer. And so we birthed this course. Jean approached me about working with him in how we could carry this forward. And to answer Julie's question, it has been through the design and implementation of this online course. We've tried to combine readings and personal interviews with a select group of veterans to accomplish that transformative learning. Gene, what's your perspective about that?
Well, Bob, you raise a good point, and it's one that I hope, again, we can leave with the those watching tonight or down the road. The engagement aspect of the First Amendment here was so important in terms of taking the citizens' rights into this field, that protecting them, sheltering them. John Lewis, who is a hero of both Professor Bickel's and mine, once said that the civil rights movement without a free press would have been as if a bird without wings, because there was an absolute recognition that the nation needed to know of the great sacrifices being made. They needed to know about the great advancements being and challenges being raised in law. Martin Luther King once said, "The only weapon we have in our hands is the weapon of protest. That's all, in order to effect this change." One of the things that David Halberstam wrote in his book, The 50s, was that the movement educated the media and the media educated America. And I think that left out of David's analysis, because he was writing about the 50s and the movement in the media, was the role of the law. You know, the right of petition gives us the right to go to government to seek change, to demand change in some cases. It does not require the government to listen or to make change. And so I think you can see the continuity here and why so many things, as Bob alluded to, they discuss the movement or they discuss the media or the law rather, is blending those two together, because I think, to paraphrase John Lewis, which is always a dangerous thing because John was so eloquent, but I think if the absence of media would have made the civil rights movement a bird without wings, the absence of law would have made the movement a bird without voice.
Well, in fact, John says, Gene, in fact, in Walking with the Wind, John says, where would we have been without our lawyers?
Yeah. So that what we try to do in this course, and Bob, I'm going to ask you a question about the most significant, we start with Brown versus Board of Education as a sort of seminal moment where the rejection of effectively, 100 and plus years or so of the movement past slavery into Reconstruction. Then you get Jim Crow, legalized segregation, and then you get to Brown versus Board, which is itself a culmination of a number of cases, but also other advancements in, say, desegregating the military and desegregating first colleges and universities. Brown versus Board was that seminal moment. And often people will chart the start of the modern civil rights change that led to the Voting Rights Act in the mid-60s. They start with that case. What in your mind, and we do this in the course, is probably the most significant case that we discuss?
Well, first, let me go back to John Lewis's statement, where would we have been without our lawyers? And underscore your point that it is the second purpose in our online course is to understand that without the synergy of the relationship between constitutional law as embodied in those opinions, starting with Brown, and the direct action campaign, without the synergy of those two forces together, the movement could not have happened and could not have been successful. No point is more, I can't pick one case that's more important than that statement, that the synergy of constitutional law and the direct action campaign is what we needed to see. And with your reference to David, his book, The 50s, is an unsung great book. But historians tended to write about the direct action campaign. Constitutional law professors authors tended to talk about the cases. And you can't do that. And so our purpose became to make it apparent that the two were bonded. So this online course, in every aspect, weaves the First Amendment and the Civil Rights Amendments, the 13th and particularly 14th and 15th Amendments, together. That's its purpose, its highest purpose. With respect to this year's conference, I think we can say that assembly, press, and petition were reawakened during the movement. And the thing that I love about your discussion of Brown as the beginning point is that the great C.T. Vivian says that the movement was actually born in Montgomery with the bus boycott.
Right.
Because it was the night that Martin said, the only weapon we have in our hands tonight is the weapon of protest. But it was also the first application of Brown, not to education, but to a broad-scale social equality, brilliantly illustrated or exemplified by the bus boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott, which reawakened both assembly, the mass meetings were all in Black churches, so we can add the religion clause. Don't forget, and I will constantly toss this in, that it's all 5 freedoms of the First Amendment that make the movement successful. We're emphasizing 2 or 3 at this session, but all of them worked together. And the religion clause worked because speech within religion was the heart and soul of Black social activism. The Montgomery bus boycott was the first boycott, or the first mass protest of government by the victims of discrimination themselves. It was a movement from within. And therefore, you see that bond between Black churches as a place of assembly for the strategic plan of social activism. I suppose, Gene, after that, in terms of free speech, I would have to say that the greatest case, although it came at the end of the movement, because it was a crescendo, and I might add, because it was about voting rights, the very heart of democracy, the very basis of a second Civil Rights Act 1 year after the 64 Act, when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. Williams versus Wallace becomes the greatest First Amendment case ever written, because it speaks to assembly in the context of Frank Johnson having to approve a multi-thousand person 52-mile march from Selma to Montgomery. Mass assembly and protest doesn't get any bigger than that. And Williams becomes, for that reason, the greatest First Amendment opinion ever written. It's because it was about the very heart of democracy, voting rights. It had no precedent, and it reawakened the last thing you mentioned, the petition clause. And so assembly and petition literally are like the cymbals clashing at the end of a great symphony. They turned on a surge of energy in America that I don't think we've done since. When I just imagine the words assembly and petition, and then I think of Selma and the Voting Rights March, I have to say it's the capstone case if you read only one. And there's another reason, and that is that the marchers were, as you can see in all the NBC News footage, peaceful and still. At the beginning of that march, the 2 people in the front of the median on the highway are John Lewis and Hosea Williams, and the police charge them on horseback, tear gas them, beat them, and trample them. And so here we have peaceful mass protests petitioning the government for the redress of grievances. And you mentioned the government doesn't have to listen. The government didn't just not listen, it retaliated. It used the force of government, law enforcement, and political power to suppress that mass march by beating people, the South hoped, into giving up that march. And so Judge Johnson's order, when he saw that attack on the marchers, was the most powerful statement about the right of peaceful mass protests that I've ever read and I think will ever be written.
You know, Bob, for me, in developing this course and doing the research, I was struck by and reminded of first a personal memory, but also of, for those journalism students who are watching, of what I have to say is the sort of mixed record of the role of the press in covering issues around social justice, but also the role of the First Amendment in preserving some core rights for groups that were often denied rights in other areas. You know, for a long time, in terms of assembly, as Bob noted, it was the Black church and the Black press that carried first the philosophical journey of convincing our society of the evils of first slavery, and then of protesting the gradual removal of rights under Jim Crow that were established immediately after the Civil War. But also the Black press up until the 1950s or so, of really being a singular voice to track and record and document this incredible series of terrible crimes, denial of really human rights to a huge portion of our population. I wish I could tell you that, as Bob was hearkening back to his youth, that in mine, I grew up in a more enlightened era. But just to give you a personal story, I began my career as a journalist in 1969 at the Greenfield, Indiana Daily Reporter, a small circulation newspaper. I think it was 6,000 or 7,000, small town just east of Indianapolis. I was going back to the archives one day, probably in '69, looking for an item from the past. And I came across something 5 years earlier on the back of that newspaper, which was edited and owned by a family that I would say was in some ways very forward-looking. They had a column on the back page of that 16-page daily, small town daily, with the heading, forgive me, colored notes. And I swear, as I went back further, had you robbed a bank or won a Nobel Prize, if you were a person of color, that's where the news about your accomplishments in your community would have appeared. Thankfully, by the time I got there, that policy had been abandoned. But I was struck by that. And as I look back, I see the great gaps in coverage and in reporting. Again, either by omission or commission, a conscious decision not to report. But again, television began to change all that. But it was without risk. Reporters were often threatened. Sometimes their camera equipment was damaged because they were there to record. In the portion of our course which discusses the role of the press, a 1987 symposium at the University of Mississippi at Ole Miss, people talked about going to cover murders and being told, why are you here? That's not news. That's just something that goes on here. Amazingly different landscape than we have today, where the media is seen as bringing this news to the public. And very often, those people were used to the media being part and parcel of hiding those stories. But again, I think as the leaders of the civil rights movement recognized, they needed to educate the media. And there was this new medium of television. But even there were barriers.
Gene, could I go back to Williams versus Wallace for a moment?
Go right ahead.
Your story rings so true for several reasons. I'll start with Williams. If it had not been for the television coverage of Sheriff Jim Clark's attack on John Lewis, Hosea Williams, and those marchers on the first day, Judge Johnson would not have had the evidence he needed to rule as he did in Williams versus Wallace. The only reason he could write that opinion was because of the journalists who filmed the brutality that occurred at the Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday.
Right.
And you've said a couple of other things that I think have to be understood. If you go to the future, you must look back at the past. And you've mentioned two things: the black press, and its incredibly courageous and unique decision, principally Jet and Ebony magazine, to cover Emmett Till's murder in Mississippi.
Yes.
And a lot of folks say, yes, the dam broke, as C.T. Vivian says in Montgomery. But John Lewis says the movement started when Emmett Till was murdered. And the cameras were there at that trial. The cameras were there, trained on Mamie Till. And the magazines were, the black press was there to cover the funeral of her son, Emmett Till. And in between, the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Bull Connor's attack on the demonstrators in Birmingham, the most vicious attack with attack dogs, fire hoses that we've all learned about, that all of the students know about. Where would that have educated America had those journalists not been there to cover those attacks, to write about them, publish that, and to film them?
Gene Roberts, who was then a reporter for the New York Times, later Pulitzer Prize winning editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, Bob made that point. He was talking about the difference between newspaper reporting and television, even in its early days. And he said, police dogs look like police dogs in newspapers and magazines, but on television, the dogs snarled. And I think it's that ability of television to bring you to the moment, which again is something we hope to do in this course. We're looking at the past in order to look at the future.
And in those days, we didn't have social media, we didn't have the internet, and yet the newsprint reporting and early television reporting went nationwide, and in the case of the print press, went worldwide. So again, that power of the free press enabled the assembly and petition of the direct action campaign to produce those cases, to put pressure on all three branches of government. That coverage pushed created the cases that the federal courts were required to decide. Number two, they moved the legislature to consider the bill originally enacted by Kennedy and delivered to Congress by President Kennedy. And thirdly, they required action by the executive himself. So the assembly and protest was itself the most magnificent, but it would have not accomplished its mission at all had it not been for journalism. Because everywhere you go, you see those TV cameras and you see journalists. As the children were taken to jail in Birmingham, you see journalists with scribbling on their pads as fast as they can, clicking their cameras as fast as they can for still shots. The great still shots of Charles Moore, the photography of the civil rights movement is just amazing. And as their cameras were taken from them and broken. And then the power of the press to take that film. Remember that 2 minutes of that film with those dogs and fire hoses electrified America and eventually brought them to Selma.
Again, to expand our view beyond the course, and we're going to be coming up to a period quickly where we'd like to answer your questions. Earlier this year in Seattle, a judge restrained the federal government from stopping the press from covering protests there. And of course, then in Des Moines, a reporter who was faced misdemeanor charges of failure to disperse and interference with official acts, was acquitted of those charges in a very controversial case. In both cases, as we saw in the 1950s and 60s, but continuing through today, the watchdog role of a free press, which was also prized by the movement, and which I think would apply and will apply, hopefully, in the future. This ability to be there on behalf of the public to see what happens, not just rely on official reports, is important that we emphasize. And I think you'll see that again in the discussion of the press in our course. Very eloquent decision by the judge a judge in Portland, talking about the necessity of an independent third party to be there to judge the actions of authorities when dealing with these protesters and people bringing up issues of social justice. It cannot be simply dismissed by police or other authorities. I think it's very important that journalists go into these future events with the idea that we should not be portrayed, journalists should not be portrayed as representing some elite or some independent group that needs to be there. Journalists are there on behalf of the public. Again, the movement recognized that and really challenged journalists to be that. I think we would like to challenge you to carry that role forward, to say that you were there to document, not to judge, not to be the critic per se, but to present to the public what is really going on when Black Lives Matter marchers move down a street or gather in a meeting. Was it appropriate for police to use this tactic or that tactic, or to respond to certain kinds of incidents, or to violence, which has happened in all too many cases, out of whatever motive, frustration, anger. And again, I think you'll get a grounding of how this intersection of law with independent judiciary, making decisions, using evidence often presented in the press, not only by litigants, is an essential linkage of how we talk to each other as a nation and arrive at decisions, sometimes through public opinion and sometimes through the courts. Julia, are we at the point where we should respond to some questions? Bob, you may want to conclude this part.
Before we go to Julie, your last point is so important. I need to second it. When we look, let's just take the issue of Black Lives Matter. There is no more direct analogy to Black Lives Matter than Martin Luther King's leadership from 1955 to 1968. The issue was the same. This country had amazingly, you mentioned Brown v. Board, this country had amazingly decided Brown v. Board, the issue of race, unanimously in favor of equality under the 14th Amendment. An incredible decision. And yet it took assembly and petition, mass marches, the weapon of protest. And that weapon was because of assembly, the size and constancy, the 13 years of assembly and petition, because those are words for mass protests, peaceful mass protests. And in those days, the government and law enforcement retaliated against them, and the people who protected them and who were called on to protect them were the journalists who covered them, so that the courts could enforce those 5 clauses of the First Amendment. The First Amendment and could not be the movement could not be any better approach to every social justice issue that students of journalism will cover, any movement, now or in the future, to see both that it takes peaceful mass protests to make democracy work. And it is at that moment that are the glory days of the press. That's when journalists stand up, unbiased, except for democracy. The response of journalists to the movement was absolutely heroic. They're two unsung heroes of the movement. The peaceful mass protesters, that's assembly and petition. The second unsung heroes are the journalists who reported it.
Well, I appreciate this overview. We have really been treated to something special here tonight with history brought to life. We're looking forward to looking at the multimedia course a little more closely. I do have a few questions for you, though. So the first one that I want to ask is, I'm curious as to your reflections on the effectiveness of the civil rights movement in using the tools of the First Amendment compared to today with some of the movements that we see happening. Do you believe that the future spells promise for Black Lives Matter, for the Me Too movement, for some of those other protests that are really trying to push for change? Will we see that change as we did with the civil rights movement?
Julie, if I could take a stab at that first, let me use three recent kinds of protest movements to talk about effectiveness. If you go back to something called the Tea Party, one of the most effective things the reason that their impact is long lasting is that they were able to use political power along with their presence and use of the First Amendment. They spoke, they marched, they wrote letters to the press. Very often they didn't feel the press was giving them fair coverage, mostly a conservative movement looking at press as liberal. But they were able to employ, to some degree, the law, but also this continuity aspect of political influence. So they were able to elect people. They were very effective. If you look at then what the Occupy movement that came right somewhat after that, the Occupy movement, for those not familiar with it, was essentially occupying public spaces, demanding social change, saying basically, we're going to stay in public plazas, we're going to camp, we're going to do certain things, occupy space across the country to produce social change. Quite honestly, in my view, they were not very effective beyond the immediate attention that they got by raising the issue, because they didn't do what the civil rights movement did, which was turn to the law very often. I mean, they would fight an injunction that said you can't camp, but they weren't able to energize changes in law beyond that to really address the issues that they were concerned about. So I think Black Lives Matter has a challenge because very often what they're talking about is, frankly, working through the criminal courts rather than trying to gain the right to sit at a lunch counter. They're trying to protect the right not to be killed by a police officer or have that random acts of violence against people. So they're working in the criminal area. I think they're at a juncture where they need to transfer that in the future. Activists will need to transfer it as a civil rights movement into specific pushes for law. And we're now seeing that being transferred to the voting rights area. So I don't want to ignore that. Obviously, Black Lives Matter is still concerned. We're going through the trial of George Floyd right now. But there is a necessity, I think, for that movement now, this increased attention for demand for social justice, to transfer that to concrete changes in law that can produce lasting change, or at least attempt to force lasting change. You can't legislate attitude, but you can legislate law and mandates that people are supposed to live up to. And I think that's where the Black Lives Matter challenge is in the future. And the challenge for anyone interested in social change is to translate the power of the emotion of the moment to more than a focus on the moment, to say what will produce lasting change in society.
Now, Julie, let me go back to my day with your question. We expected resistance. The 11 Confederate states openly opposed Brown v. Board, and they did it violently. And that violence was expected. And those who came together in assembly and who petitioned their government expected to be beaten, attacked, shot, and jailed for what was the subject of their protest. Amazingly, because the law was on their side already. And that response of government, that violent response, forced the courts to insist on the implementation of Brown. And that's what all the cases we write about in the 5 parts of the course are about, is that the courts were forced into the role of not allowing the South to use a perverted states' rights argument to enforce Jim Crow racial segregation. Now let's fast forward to Black Lives Matter. I'm going to look through a bit of a different lens and leave the audience to their reaction. What amazes me more than anything today is that through all that, government in 1963 actually began to listen. In 1960, Martin Luther King met with Robert F. Kennedy, the newly appointed Attorney General of the United States. Think of that. Martin Luther King, the leader of the biggest mass protest movement in modern American history, is meeting with the Attorney General of the United States. Would that have happened during the last 8 to 10 years, or 8 years? And so my question is, will that begin to happen? Until we rid ourselves of the repressive and even violent use of law enforcement to suppress assembly and petition, and until government listens and doesn't engage in obstructionist tactics to repress or impede or delay social change, we're going backwards, not forwards. So to me, the people who don't get it and the people whose focus journalism needs to remain on are not the protesters. They're doing it right for the most part. It's the fact that government doesn't listen, or that we are in some sort of a tribal two-party politics that just is a failure compared to what government finally was willing to own up to in the 1960s. It turns the world on its head.
Yeah.
That back then we got the government to listen, and we don't now.
Yeah, Bob, you remind me, and I failed to check Iowa's status in this, and I apologize. But I think now 43 states have some form of legislation designed to limit demonstrations and protests.
Yes. Yes.
I know I'm sitting in Indiana right now, where I'm sort of have been sheltering from the COVID rather than DC, where our offices are. In Indiana, there is now, and in other states, there are now provisions being proposed or adopted, which, for example, would lessen or eliminate penalties for striking a protester with your car if they're in the street, which is actually a Supreme Court right to go into the street to protest. They're increasing dramatically the penalties for joining at times in protests that grow violent. DeRay McKesson, one of the founders of the Black Lives Movement, has a case that the Supreme Court recently sent back to a lower court, in which a police officer is saying that you organized a rally in which ultimately a violent person injured me. You are personally liable in a financial way for those damages because you should have known that your protest would have resulted in violence. We're seeing variations of that, increasing penalties from misdemeanors to felonies. For simply participating in a demonstration in which there is violence, you may not have caused that violence. But again, it's almost a conspiracy or guilt by association kind of law. 43 states are adopting those kind of provisions. So even as we're watching what many characterize as attempts to limit voter engagement or involvement or opportunities to vote, we're watching this attempt to limit the rights of petition and assembly in states under this idea that we need to bring order. Again, a phrase, law and order, that was rampant in the 50s and 60s by those who would have silenced the demonstrations and movement at that time to do that. So again, does the public, are they aware of this? They all have cute names like, saving democracy moment or preserving peace, legislation. They have cute names. What they really do is suppress the rights of petition and assembly.
Yeah, Julie, I think this is a perfect, Gene's got a perfect answer to your question, because when I say we're getting lost, I want to make sure that as journalists, when we talk about assembly and petition, we don't lose in our coverage of voter suppression laws, we don't lose the direct suppression of peaceful mass protest. I'm in one of those 43 states, like Gene is, and to think that the majority of states are not just engaged in voter suppression, something we could have a whole conference about, but the direct suppression of peaceful assembly and mass protest is bizarre, is absolutely bizarre.
Yes, the legislation is being discussed here in Iowa. As a matter of fact, at the earlier session today for our First Amendment days, that very issue was mentioned. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Another question that I have, and I'll start with you, Professor, on this one, is especially for the young people in the audience, how did the activists keep from getting discouraged? How did they continue to push ahead despite the obstacles that you've talked about being put in their way?
There are two stories behind your question that are amazing. One is that when Bobby met Martin that first time, Gene and my mutual friend, John Siegenthaler, was Bobby's aide. And he was the only other person in the room sitting between the two of them. And he tells the story that Bobby and his chief litigator, John Doerr, wanted Martin to allow the courts to resolve the issue of racial equality. Martin said, I appreciate your support, and we are participating in that. Wiley Branton in Atlanta has a whole initiative on voter suppression. But we cannot lose sight that we must protest segregation, the issue at hand, wherever we see it. So let's broaden that to today. What we've got to do is engage in, first, the mass protest of every form of inequality wherever we see it. Now, there's reason in why I say that. The idea of assembly and therefore mass petition of government gives you the strength not to be defeated. If you're not going to be listened to because you don't have direct political power and Congress or the executive are getting in your way, you have the power, if you agree, to never give up, to be sustained. So here's what the movement had that I wonder about today. During 1961 and the Freedom Rides, the students began being beaten viciously from 61 to 63. But in 61 in Montgomery and 63 in Birmingham, they were beaten viciously by law enforcement. In 61, and they were jailed. And of course, the Freedom Riders were ultimately sent to maximum security state penitentiaries, including in solitary confinement for peaceful mass protest. And here's what I wonder about. Their credo was that no matter how violently they were attacked, they would not give up. They were interviewed, and there's TV footage that says, "Are you afraid?" And their answer is, "Yes, we're afraid. But if we give up, if we don't continue protesting, even in the face of retaliation, then those who would oppress us win." And so our friend John Siegenthaler emphasizes that the movement was the victim of some of the most violent retaliation by government against mass protest, assembly, and petition in American history, and they didn't stop. When the first riders were beaten in Anniston and Birmingham, a second wave of riders got on buses and kept coming. And those protests lasted for 13 years. That's what I wonder about today. Do we have the kind of resolve that, number one, Dr. King actually said, you have to go to jail with love. You can't fight back. A blow was not allowed to be struck. No violence that occurred during the movement by demonstrators was ever approved by the movement. It was disapproved by the movement. And laws that hold, like the one Gene's talking about, it is like holding Dr. King responsible for anybody who committed any act of violence during the movement. Certain people could not hold it together. Most did, but the message of the movement was that you must move on non-violently, even though you are being subjected to violence. And that takes risk. That's the biggest risk you can take. And that's what I wonder about, Gene, with modern movements, because the answer should be, the answer is easy. The government should stop retaliating against protesters.
Right. You know, Bob, one of the things that Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers for the NAACP managed to, I think, infuse into the movement was to move away from being reactive to events and being proactive, to set a prize, to set a goal, to use the courts to say, this is what we want to accomplish. We want to eliminate this legal barrier, that legal barrier.
Right.
So they moved to be reactive. And again, I think that's the challenge in the current movement, is to move to that proactive nature. And Bob talks about commitment. That came out of preparation. There were literal schools created to train protesters in nonviolence, in which people would portray the people who were going to attack them at lunch counters, who would use the most vile racial epithets, the most attempts to anger these people, so that when they were faced that on the street, when they were dealt with that by police charges or violence, they were somewhat prepared. Another John Siegenthaler story, when the second wave was coming from Nashville to replace the original Freedom Rider group that had been beaten and to the point where they could not continue. Bobby Kennedy was concerned about violence and was said basically to John, you're a Southerner, even though he was from Nashville, which is sort of Mid-South. Can you convince these kids, a lot of whom were coming from Nashville, not to continue, that we will carry on the fight legally? John called back and recounted a conversation he had with a young woman whose name escapes me at the moment, but he said, Bobby, I want to give you an idea. Well, he said, Mr. Attorney General, I'd like to give you an idea how committed we are. He had a conversation with this young woman, asking her not to go through. And she said, Mr. Siegenthaler, you don't understand. We wrote our wills last night. And he went back to Bobby Kennedy and said, we cannot stop that kind of, we don't want to stop that kind of commitment, but we couldn't if we wanted to.
Right.
This is how serious they are. But that was as a result of preparation. And again, this combination of law and the necessity to highlight these, what in that case was segregation and on interstate bus travel.
And Julie, what that produced, let's again use the latest case, Williams versus Wallace. What that produced is the absolute demand that Judge Johnson rule that police retaliation and suppression of both freedom of speech and the right to vote had to stop. The march had to occur. The right of the people to march from Selma to Montgomery to petition their government for voting rights, and the right of Black folk to register, qualified Black voters to register to vote, had to be protected. And that was the turning to the law part, that the beating at the bridge occurred. And the evidence was government's retaliation against free speech. That's the definitive evidence, the retaliation against the leader of a movement, holding him responsible when the movement is peacefully protesting, but there are abnormalities of violence that, by the way, could be contrived, as they were in Memphis in 1968 during the sanitation workers' protest. There was brokered violence there, so that the police would have an excuse to move in.
Yeah, Bob, that takes us to a question I see from the YouTube chat of parallels on the role of the media during the civil rights movement of that era and today. And that's exactly it. It is documenting what goes on. What we need is, and I want to say this in the right way. We need a press that can be trusted to bring an accurate report, but one is also that is there to be an accurate report. So that while there is often, I think, an understandable temptation, we have to avoid what I would call advocacy as journalists in order to be the honest brokers of information. And I see much of that going on. But in a social media world, I think there is an intermix now, which is often confusing to people who look at reports that are, by advocates, as well as by those from objective journalism. And I think what we need for journalists to do is to constantly emphasize this idea of we are there on your behalf, presenting a fair report.
Yeah.
In order to bring this, because I think this witness aspect was so important, again, during the modern civil rights movement. It is as important today when all of us have access to 1,000 sources with different points of view about what went on. There needs to be a trusted source of information that will give us the account of what happened. And that is holding demonstrators at times accountable, as well as police. So that, again, I think that's a future role for media that I hope we can regain the trust of viewers and listeners and users. And
I've got to ask your opinion on one other aspect of that question. I'd love to see fewer talking heads in a studio and more reporting from the street during the demonstrations of what's going on.
Yeah,
that was a huge distinction in journalism in the movement. The journalists were there on the scene, and that's what got the airtime much more than even Walter Cronkite in the studio later that night. And now I'm listening to hundreds of hours of talking heads and just little bits and pieces of what's going on the street comparatively. And I'd love to see more contextual reporting. And you've got to be a brave journalist to do that. They're my heroes. The journalists that are in the middle of that protest are my heroes, as they were then.
Well, thank you so much. On that note, I do want to share with the audience that, talking about one of those hero journalists, we will have Andrea Sahori sharing her story on Thursday at noon. And she is the reporter from the Des Moines Register that Jean mentioned, who was arrested, went all the way to trial, and ultimately was acquitted So we hope you can join us on Thursday. We also have events tomorrow and Wednesday, as well as Friday. So the rest of this week, just packed full of good stuff having to do with some assembly required. And to Professor Bickel and to Jean Policinski, I can't thank you enough. We really have been treated tonight to something special, as I said before. And the multimedia course, I think we can all agree, is a true treasure that we have linked in our chat, and we've also linked it online so that others can go out and find your way to this resource that really is a gem. So thank you so much for your time this evening, and thank you to the audience as well. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.